Before we get into 1 Kings, we'll look at our outline of really 1 and 2 Kings together, as we've outlined the two books together into three major sections. The first 11 chapters of the book of 1 Kings is the reign of Solomon. Chapter 1 and 2, you have some chapter 1 is where Solomon's brother tries to seek the throne. Chapter 2, and he's anointed. Chapter 2, David's final exhortations to him. And then he takes over and carries out David's final instructions there in chapter 2. And then he rules on through chapter 11. That's where we have the death of Solomon recorded for us. Beginning in chapter 12, we have the story of Rehoboam, where the kingdom divides and 10 tribes go to Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, and the other 2 stay with Rehoboam, just as it had been prophesied to Jeroboam previously. And that goes through 2 Kings 17. As in 2 Kings 18, we have the fall of Israel. And then on 19 through 25, we have the final days and fall of Judah as well because of their wickedness. We're also going through 2 Chronicles. We began 2 Chronicles last week. We divided it into two major sections. 1 through 9 we said is the reign of Solomon. And then 10 through 36 is the kings of Judah during the divided kingdom. Remember, we said last week that the book of Chronicles is focusing on the line of David. And so we're going to follow Judah throughout. So as we go through 2 Chronicles, we will encounter stories that mention Israel, but we will encounter Israel as they encounter the people of Judah. And so we're following the line of Judah. That's why we outline the kings of Judah during the divided kingdom. We're going to study 1 Kings 5 and 2 Chronicles 2 paralleled, and then we'll go through chapter 6 and through chapter 3 individually after that. So we want to turn to 1 Kings 5, and we'll also be paralleling bringing some points in from 2 Chronicles chapter 2 as we move throughout this as well. But before we get started in chapter 5, remember, as we're following the reign of Solomon, chapter 3 is probably the two most familiar stories of the reign of Solomon to us. And what was it happen in chapter 3? Two things happened in chapter 3. Right. He asked for wisdom at the beginning of chapter 3. He demonstrated his wisdom there at the end of chapter 3. Chapter 4 was focused on the officials of Solomon. By the way, here's why we remember, for the most part, here's why we remember that story in the life of Solomon. You know what the majority of the rest of the recording of Solomon's reign is? The vast majority of what's left is about building the temple and what's recorded in the life of Solomon. We'll talk about the temple and preparations, some final preparations made. Remember, David has made a lot of preparations beforehand, but we'll talk about some preparations made here in chapter 5. And then chapter 6, they'll begin some of the work. Same thing going over in Chronicles. Next week, we'll see where they're finishing it up and Solomon's prayer of dedication and all of that takes place in chapter 7, 8, and 9. But the majority of his reign is focused on the building of the temple. Right. David didn't build the temple because of the blood on his hands. And we'll see that brought up here in a moment as well by Solomon. So again, that's why we remember chapter 3 very well. We also remember chapter 11 that talks about Solomon falling away in chapter 11 because of his many wives. We remember the beginning of chapter 11 as well, right before his death. Those are really probably the three main things we remember from the life of Solomon, because the majority of his reign is talking about the building of the temple. But let's take a look at chapter 5 and 2 Chronicles 2 together. The first 6 verses of chapter 5, which parallels the first 10 of 2 Chronicles 2, is a request to Hiram, king of Tyre. 2 Chronicles 2 said, "Now Solomon decided to build a house for the name of the Lord." Now, Solomon's decided to build a house for the name of the Lord. It says also in a royal palace for himself. We'll see that brought up next week as well, where he's building that palace in chapter 7 of 1 Kings. But Solomon is very much aware of the fact that it was prophesied by God, sent through Nathan to David, that it was going to be David's son who was going to build the house for God. In fact, he's going to be mentioned later on by Solomon. But Solomon now has decided he's going to build the house for the name of the Lord. This is now when Solomon's getting ready to build a house for the Lord. We'll see later on the time frame at which this has taken place. But it says that Solomon decided in 2 Chronicles 2:1 to build a house for the name of the Lord. 1 Kings 5:1 says, Now Hiram, king of Tyre, sent his servants to Solomon when he heard that they had anointed him king in the place of his father. And Hiram also had always been a friend of David. So Hiram had been a friend of David, the king of Tyre, and so he sends servants to Solomon after he hears Solomon has been anointed as the next king. And as these servants come to Solomon here, Solomon sends word back to Hiram saying, You know that David my father was unable to build a house for the name of the Lord his God because of the wars which surrounded him until the Lord put them under the soles of his feet. So Solomon is very much aware as to why David was not the one to build the temple. David has told him that in some of David's instructions to him previously. David tells him, I was not allowed to build a temple because I was a man of war. David tells the people that. When David is telling the people, the Lord has chosen Solomon, we saw last week, to be the next king. And it is Solomon that will build a house for the name of the Lord. Because remember, David has been making preparations all along. He couldn't build the house, but he had been making preparations. And so David had told them, this is why the Lord said I could not build the house for him. He told Solomon that. He told the people that. Well, Hiram, the king of Tyre, and Hiram had always been a friend of David. And so Solomon points out to Hiram, Hiram, you know that my father could not be the one to build the house. So it seems Hiram was well aware of the fact that David had wanted to build a house but could not. He points out the fact that it was because he was a man of war and there were the wars that surrounded him until the Lord put them under the soles of his feet. So Solomon, in sending word to Hiram, says, listen, you know my father wanted to build a house. He could not build a house for the Lord because he was a man of war until the enemies were put under his feet. But look at verse 4. Now the Lord my God has given me rest on every side. There is neither adversary nor misfortune. Verse 4 is very important. Though we may not necessarily realize it as we quickly glance through the text, we need to remember something from chapter 3. Remember back in chapter 3, go back to chapter 3 for just a second. Back in 1 Kings chapter 3, Solomon makes a request, or Solomon is asked, the Lord just tells him, ask what would you have me do for you? Or ask what you wish me to give you. And Solomon says, remember in chapter 3 we saw last week, Solomon says, that I'm young, I have the wisdom and the understanding to guide your people. They're a great people, so give me the understanding I need. So it said in verse 11 that God said to him, because you have asked this thing and have not asked for yourself long life, nor have asked riches for yourself, nor have you asked for the life of your enemies, but you have asked for yourself discernment to understand justice. Behold, I have done according to your words. Behold, I have given you a wise and discerning heart, so there has been no one like you before you, nor shall one like you arise after you. I have also given what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that there will be none among the kings like you all your days. If you walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and commandments as your father David walked, then I will prolong your days. And so he says that he would give him the riches and the honor that was not been among the other kings all his days. He would give him the things he had not asked for. He had mentioned, you could have asked for long life, you could have asked for riches, you could have asked for peace from your enemies. You didn't. The things you haven't asked, I'll give to you as well. In chapter 4 of 1 Kings, when we came to the end of chapter 4, it was talking about all of the things of Solomon and all his riches and his wisdom and all of this in chapter 4. But it mentioned in verse 24 of chapter 4, for he had dominion over everything west of the river, from Tiphsah even to Gaza, over all the kings west of the river, and he had peace on all sides around him. We said last week that's being fulfilled what God had told him. Solomon mentions that here in chapter 5. Now remember, David cannot build the temple because he is a man of war. Solomon is going to build the temple for God. And in Solomon's request for wisdom, God said, I'll give you wisdom and I'll give you wealth and I'll give you long life if you serve me, and I'll give you peace from your enemies. Now Solomon here acknowledges the fact that he has rest on every side. He has peace from his enemies. It's just like God had said in the promise that I'll give you what you have not asked for. God kept His promise to Solomon. That's an important lesson for us to learn. Right, He gave him a lot more than what he had asked for. In fact, the land becomes very wealthy. He has the peace and all of that around him. Paralleling to 2 Chronicles real quick. In 2 Chronicles 2 and in verse 4, and you might want to put a marker in 2 Chronicles and keep your finger at 1 Kings, because we'll come back to 1 Kings, but we're going to parallel the two. In 2 Chronicles 2:4, it says, Behold, I am about to build a house for the name of the Lord my God, dedicating it to Him, to burn fragrant incense before Him, and to set out the showbread continually, and to offer burnt offerings morning and evening on Sabbaths and new moons, and of appointed feast of the Lord our God, this being required forever in Israel. The house which I am about to build will be great, for greater is our God than all the gods. And so Solomon is making the point here to Hiram, or Hyrums, if you look in 2 Chronicles account, and points out that I'm fixing to build this house for God, and this house that I'm building for God is the house that's going to be used for what? The sacrifices. This is the house that's going to be used for the worship. It's where we're going to burn the fragrant incense before Him. It's where we're going to set out the showbread. It's where we're going to offer burnt offerings in mornings and evenings, on the Sabbaths, on the new moons, on appointed feast of the Lord our God, this being required forever in Israel. So here he makes the point that we're building this temple for God, this temple that's used for worship to God, this temple used for the sacrifices that is to be made. He also points out that the house he will build for God is great, for greater is our God than all the gods. So here as you send word to Hiram, king of Tyre, and you think about all the nations around them, what are the nations around them worshiping? Idols. And he sends word to Hiram, and in this Solomon makes the point, this temple is going to be great. For greater is our God than all the gods. Listen, the God that we serve, the one true God, is greater than all the gods that y'all have. It is greater than all the idols that you think you serve and all of these gods that everyone believes there is. It is great. He is greater than all the gods. And Solomon points that out there to Hiram. Now, back to 1 Kings 5. In 1 Kings 5 and in verse 5, this is why we said earlier, Solomon is aware of the fact that it was prophesied he was going to build the house for the Lord. He said in verse 3 that his father David had intended to but could not because he was a man of war. He says in verse 4 that he has rest on every side. And now verse 5. Behold, I intend to build a house for the name of the Lord our God, as the Lord spoke to David my father, saying, Your son, whom I set on your throne in your place, will build the house for my name. We said earlier that the Lord keeps His promises, and we appealed to what we saw in chapter 3 for that. Where in chapter 3 and in chapter 4 we see that the Lord had given what He hadn't promised, and we talked about the rest on all sides. Here's another place where we see the Lord keeping His promise. Go all the way back to the promise that was made previously to David. When David is promised that his son would sit on the throne after him, when David is promised that his son is the one who would build the house for the name of the Lord, that is all the way back in 2 Samuel chapter 7. By the way, here's how long ago 2 Samuel 7 was. When 2 Samuel 7 takes place, do you know who's not even born yet? Solomon. Remember, as you follow through, 2 Samuel 7 is that promise there about the building of the temple taking place in 2 Samuel chapter 7. Now, do you remember who is Solomon's mother? Bathsheba. When are we introduced to Bathsheba? Chapter 11 of 2 Samuel. So the promise is taking place in chapter 7. We're introduced to Bathsheba in chapter 11. And then at what point exactly Solomon's born, we don't know, but we know this. When 2 Samuel 11 takes place, that's the sin of adultery with David and Bathsheba. The child conceived in that adulterous relationship is born and then dies. It's later that Solomon is born, because he's mentioned in chapter 12. When in chapter 12 of 2 Samuel, as they're talking about the sin with Bathsheba, in 2 Samuel 12, it said in verse 24 that David comforted his wife Bathsheba and went into her and lay with her, and she gave birth to a son, and he named him Solomon. So that takes place after the death of the first child. So it's some time prior to that when this promise is made, your son is going to build a house for my name. The son that was going to build a house for the name of, or for the Lord, the son that was going to sit on the throne, hasn't even been born yet. Now, David's got sons as of 2 Samuel chapter 7, but not Solomon. But Solomon appeals to the fact here in 1 Kings chapter 5 that that promise made back in 2 Samuel chapter 7 had a reference to him. Now, we know it also has reference to Christ because of Peter's use of it in Acts chapter 2 when he alludes to it in Acts 2. But it was referring in the short term to Solomon, who would build the physical temple. And then it was referring to Christ, who would establish the church, who would sit on the throne and rule forever. 2 Samuel 7 was as well. But Solomon at that time wasn't even born yet. But Solomon takes there and says that this is what my father was told, that his son was going to be the one to build a house. The Lord kept his word. Again, Solomon wasn't even born at the time that promise was made. But here it is, Solomon making preparations and taking over for the building of the temple, just like the Lord had told David. Now look at verse 6. Now therefore command that they cut for me cedars from Lebanon, and my servants will be with your servants, and I will give you wages for your servants according to all that you say, for you know that there is no one among us who knows how to cut timber like the Sidonians. And so the cedars of Lebanon were some of was the best wood around, and so Solomon says, we want some of those cedars of Lebanon for the building of the temple. Our men don't know how to cut it like the Sidonians do, so give us some people to help us in the cutting down of these trees. Beginning at verse 7 of chapter 5, also beginning at verse 11 and going through verse 16 of chapter 2 of 2 Chronicles, is Hyrums' answer to Solomon. When Hiram heard the words of Solomon, he rejoiced greatly and said, Blessed be the Lord today, who has given to David a wise son over this great people. Hiram said in verse 7 is praising the Lord for setting up Solomon as the ruler in Israel. But what is it he appeals to of Solomon that he praises the Lord for him being set up? Because he's wise. In verse 7, blessed is the Lord who has given David a wise son over his great people. 2 Chronicles 2:11 words it differently. Then Hiram, same person, Hiram or Hiram, depending on which account you're reading, king of Tyre, answered in a letter sent to Solomon, because the Lord loves his people, he made you king over them. What do you think it means, because the Lord loves his people, he's made you king over them? The people are being blessed because of the rule of Solomon. And that's why he talks about the Lord who loves his people has made you ruler. Israel is going to prosper under Solomon in a way they've never prospered at any time before, nor would they ever prosper again. In fact, you remember when it talks about the reign of Solomon, silver was so common, it was as common as what? It was as common as rocks. That's a lot of silver in the days of Solomon. That's how wealthy and well-to-do the nation of Israel is at that time. And so they're going to prosper at this time under Solomon. They're going to have peace and all these things they will never have again. The kingdom will eventually divide, so they won't be as strong. Israel's going to be ruled by wicked man after wicked man, as there's no man to sit on the throne who was righteous. There would be some righteous men to rule over the southern kingdom, but only some. And for the most part, they were wicked as well. And none of them had near the wisdom of Solomon. Remember, it was told to Solomon he would have wisdom unlike anybody that before or after. And so the people are prospering at this time, unlike any way they will ever prosper again. And so Hyrums says that blessed is the Lord who has made you ruler over his people. In verse 8, Hiram sent word to Solomon, saying, I have heard the message which you have sent to me. I will do what you desire concerning the cedar and cypress timber. My servants will bring them down from Lebanon to the sea, and I will make them into rafts to go by sea to the place where you direct me. And I have them broken up there, and you shall carry them away. Then you shall accomplish my desire by giving food to my household. So Hiram gave Solomon as much as he desired for the cedar and the cypress timber. Solomon then gave Hiram 20,000 cores of wheat as food for his household, and 20 cores of beaten oil. Thus Solomon would give Hiram year by year. The Lord gave wisdom to Solomon, just as he promised him. And there was peace between Hiram and Solomon, and the two of them made a covenant. And so Hiram says, I'll send the help. Here's what I want in payment in return. Solomon does so. But it said in verse 12 that the Lord gave the wisdom to Solomon. Again, we've talked about this already. The Lord keeps his promises. He gave wisdom to Solomon just as he promised him. The Lord kept his promise. But not only did he give wisdom to Solomon just as he had promised, there was peace between Hiram and Solomon, and the two of them made a covenant. He has peace with Hiram just as he has peace with everyone else around him. 13 through 18 is a list of some of the workers of Solomon. Solomon levied forced laborers, verse 13, from all Israel. And the forced laborers were numbered 30,000 men. He sent them to Lebanon, 10,000 a month in relays. They were in Lebanon a month and 2 months at home. And Adoniram was over the forced laborers. Now Solomon had 70,000 transporters and 80,000 hewers of stone in the mountains. Besides Solomon's 3,300 chief deputies who were over the project and who ruled over the people who were doing the work, the king commanded, and they quarried great stones, costly stones, to lay the foundation of the house with cut stones. So Solomon's builders and Hiram's builders and the Gebalites cut them and prepared the timbers and the stones to build the house. There's quite a workforce here working on the temple. 30,000 forced laborers. They would send them in a month shift and 2 months at home, 10,000 at a time, to Lebanon for working on it. But there were 70,000 transporters and 80,000 hewers of stone and 3,300 chief deputies who were over the project. And so there were quite a few, there was a large number of people working on the building of the temple with Solomon. Now let's go to 1 Kings chapter 6. We're going to actually see the temple construction get underway. Solomon's beginning to begin work here in chapter 6 and in verse 1. It came about in the 480th year after the sons of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Zib, which is the second month, that he began to build the house of the Lord. I think sometimes we forget about how much time passes from one story to the next in Scriptures. You think about the stories as you go through the story of the Exodus and the wandering in the wilderness. And we know the wandering in the wilderness is 40 years. And we flip and we see the time, it's 40 years here, it's 40 years there. But sometimes when you're reading through a story, you flip a page and almost no time at all has passed. And then you may flip another page and a great deal of time has passed. The building of the temple here, this building of the temple that they have undertaken, is going to take 7 years, according to verse 38 of chapter 6. So as we have the recording of the building of the temple and the dedication of the temple and all of that, we're having a time frame of 7 years take place. But now remember this, how long does Solomon reign in Israel? 40 years. Remember this with the United Kingdom. You had 3 kings, Saul, David, Solomon. The United Kingdom lasted for 120 years. Saul reigned for 40, David reigned for 40, Solomon reigned for 40. They all reigned for 40 years. So it's easy to remember in the United Kingdom. Each of them reigned for 40 years. At what point in Solomon's reign are we now? According to chapter 1, or verse 1. We're in year 4. It's going to take how long to build the temple? 7 years. What that means is the vast majority of what we have recorded in the reign of Solomon is the first 11 years of his reign. He reigns for a total of 40 years. So you flip through the pages and you see this is the building of the temple, and here's the description of the temple, and here's the dimensions of the temple, and here's the dedication of the temple. And you flip pages, and all that's taking place is 7 years, taking place in that time frame. And then you finish that, and you get near the end, and you flip a page, and all of a sudden you're at the end of Solomon's life. 29 more years have passed, just like that. When we turn the page, a great deal of time can pass. I say all that to say, from the time that as we follow in order, in the books in order, going back to Genesis and following all the way through, how long has it been, according to verse 1, since the Exodus? 480 years have passed. So there's the wandering in the wilderness that takes place 40 years. There's the time it took to travel there. They spent about 1.5 years at Mount Sinai. The time of the invasion and conquest. By the way, this is how we know approximately, I think it's about 300 years or so for the time of the Judges, because we take the 480 years, less the 40 years for David, less the 40 years for Saul, less the 40 years for the wandering in the wilderness, less the time it takes for invasion and conquest, less the reign, come up around over 300 years for the time of Judges. But sometimes you flip a page again. It really doesn't seem like a whole lot of time may have passed from there to now as we move through this. And all of a sudden we flip pages and 480 years have passed. As we continue to flip pages, time will move faster and faster as we go through some of the stories. Especially as we get to the close of the Old Testament, turn to the New Testament, because we have 400 years of silence taking place. But I say, as we're turning in pages, sometimes it feels like we're moving very slowly and a lot of time may pass and it's really very little. And sometimes we feel like we turn a page and it should be like it's almost the next day and 40 years have gone by. So sometimes when we're turning in the pages, we can forget how much time is taking place. Again, Solomon reigns for 40 years. The vast majority of what we read of the reign of Solomon is the first 11 years. In particular, years 4 through year 11 in the building of the temple, from chapter 5 through on through chapter 9, as we have the dedication of the temple and all of that taking place. So the majority of Solomon's reign is taking place at that point. So a lot of what we're reading is early on in the reign of Solomon. Now, let's pick up at verse 2. As for the house which King Solomon built for the Lord, its length was 60 cubits, its width 20 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. The porch in front of the nave of the house was 20 cubits in length, corresponding to the width of the house, and its depth along the front of the house was 10 cubits. Also for the house he made windows with artistic frames. Against the wall of the house he built stories encompassing the walls of the house around both the nave and the inner sanctuary. Thus he made side chambers all around. The lowest story was 5 cubits wide, and the middle was 6 cubits wide, and the third was 7 cubits wide. For an outside he made offsets in the wall of the house all around in order that the beams would not be inserted in the wall of the house. The house, while it was being built, was built on stone prepared at the quarry, and there was neither hammer nor axe nor any iron tool heard in the house while it was being built. The doorway of the lowest side chamber was at the right side of the house, and they would go up by the winding stairs to the middle story and from the middle to the third. So he built the house and finished it, and he covered the house with the beams and the planks of cedar. He also built the stories against the whole house, each 5 cubits high, and they were fastened to the house with timbers of cedar. Now the word of the Lord came to Solomon, saying, Concerning this house which you are building, if you walk in my statutes, and execute my ordinances, and keep all my commandments by walking in them, then I will carry out my word with you, which I spoke to David your father. I will dwell among the sons of Israel, and will not forsake my people Israel. So here it talks about in the reading the measurements of some of the measurements of the temple. Chapter 3 of 2 Chronicles, which we'll go through very quickly here in a moment, it talks a lot about that as well. Very similar stuff taking place there in 2 Chronicles. It's just not quite the amount of detail we're going to see here in 1 Kings chapter 6. But I want us to focus in for just a moment on verse 12 and verse 13. The Lord tells Solomon concerning the house that he was building that he would keep his commandments to David if what? Or keep his promise to David if what? Solomon would walk in the statutes and execute his ordinances and keep all the Lord's commandments by walking in them. If you do that, I will keep the promise that I have made. We talked about this last week when it came to the length of days. But I think something that is easily forgotten by people today is that promises are conditional. There are a lot of people that will say, Israel never really occupied the land. God didn't keep His promise to Israel. They didn't occupy the land of Israel forever. It was conditional. If you keep my commandments and you dwell in the land, you'll continue to dwell in the land. Promises to us are conditional. We've been promised the reward of heaven if we do His will. Promises can be conditional. That's what the Lord is telling Solomon here. I will keep my promise, but that promise I made is conditional upon your obedience. You keeping my statutes, you walking in my ordinances, you doing all that I have commanded. And if you do that, not only would He keep the word that He spoke to David, but what else? Verse 13. I will dwell with the sons of Israel and will not forsake my people, Israel. He's just said that He will not leave Israel as long as Solomon is following His commandments, as long as Israel as well is following His commandments. He specifically mentioned Solomon here, but it's for all Israel. They need to all keep His commandments. As long as they're doing that, the Lord will be with them. Unfortunately, as we continue on and we'll go throughout the history of Israel, we'll come to the point where Israel doesn't do that. And both the northern and the southern kingdom will eventually fall because they forgot the promises that God had made. Not in the sense they didn't remember, but in the sense that the way they lived was as if they just didn't know about it. And they eventually forsook the Lord, and just as was told. By the way, Haggai the prophet, in chapter 13, I believe it is in verse 6, in Haggai 13:6 says that Israel forgot the Lord, which is exactly what the Lord said would happen back in Deuteronomy chapter 6, as well as several other passages in the book of Deuteronomy, that when you get into the land and you eat and you're filled, you'll forget. That's told later on. The promises are conditional. The Lord tells Solomon here again, I will be with Israel, but it's requiring obedience that I'm not going to leave them or forsake them. And I think this is something important that we need to understand, is when the Lord allows Israel to be destroyed, it's because of Israel's falling away from Him. It's not that the Lord really and truly just completely turned His back on Israel. It's that the Lord said, I have offered you help if you do my will. You've turned your back on me, and now there's no help to be found. You can cry out, but there will be no help. That's why in the book of Isaiah, seek the Lord while He may be found. So He's telling Solomon here, as long as you do my will, as long as Israel does my will, I will be with you. I will not forsake you. But again, unfortunately, they do not follow that. 14 through 38 is a description of the temple. Solomon built the house, verse 14, and finished it. He built the walls of the house on the inside with boards of cedar from the floor of the house to the ceiling, and overlaid the walls of the inside wood, and he overlaid the floor of the house with the boards of cypress. He built 20 cubits on the rear part of the house with the boards of the cedar from the floor to the ceiling. He built them for it on the inside as an inner sanctuary, even as the most holy place. The house, that is, the nave in front of the inner sanctuary, was 40 cubits long. There was cedar on the house within, carved in the shape of gourds and of open flowers. All with cedar, there was no stone seen. Then he prepared an inner sanctuary within the house in order to place there the ark of the covenant of the Lord. The inner sanctuary was 20 cubits in length, 20 cubits in width, and 20 cubits in height. And he overlaid it with pure gold. He also overlaid the altar with cedar. So Solomon overlaid the inside of the house with pure gold, and he drew chains of gold across the front of the inner sanctuary, and he overlaid it with gold. He overlaid the whole house with gold until all the house was finished. Also the whole altar, which was by the inner sanctuary, he overlaid with gold. Also in the inner sanctuary he made 2 cherubim of olive wood. each 10 cubits high. 5 cubits was the one wing of the cherub, and 5 cubits the other wing of the cherub. From the end of one wing to the end of the other wing were 10 cubits. The other cherub was 10 cubits. Both the cherub were the same measure and the same form. The height of the one cherub was 10 cubits, and so was the other cherub. He placed the cherubim in the midst of the inner house, and the wings of the cherubim were spread out, so that the wings of the one was touching the wall, and the wing of the other cherub was touching the other wall, so their wings were touching each other in the center of the house. He also overlaid the cherubim with gold. Then he carved all the walls of the house, round about with carved engravings of cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers, inner and outer sanctuaries. He overlaid the floors of the house with gold, inner and outer sanctuaries. For the entrance of the inner sanctuary, he made doors of olive wood, the intel and 5-sided doorpost. So he made 2 doors of olive wood, and he carved on them carvings of cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers, and overlaid them with gold. And he spread the gold on the cherubim and on the palm trees. So also he made the entrance of the nave 4-sided doorpost of olive wood. And the 2 doorposts of cypress wood, the 2 leaves of the one door turned on pivots, and the 2 leaves of the other door turned on pivots. He carved on it cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers, and he overlaid them with gold, evenly applied on the engraved work. He built the inner court with 3 rows of cut stone and a row of cedar beams. In the 4th year, the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid in the month of Ziv. In the 11th year, in the month of Bul, which is the 8th month, the house was finished throughout all its parts and according to all its plans. So he was 7 years in building it. As you go through that description, you probably read through and think, well, what's the importance of all this description? I think there's something we need to remember, something this helps us with as we appreciate, as we go throughout the story. First of all, as you hear the description of this temple, what comes to your mind? It's a good point about the conditional promises and us being the temple and all that goes into it. But one word there that you mentioned I think is very key in this is the word about all the beauty that was, just how beautiful this temple probably would have been, as you look at it. By the way, that's interesting. Go ahead.
I think it brings out obedience as well. You know, the obedience that went into the project. It kind of reminds me of whenever God told Noah to build the ark. Well, just exactly what he wanted and how he wanted it built.
Obedience that goes in, that's a good point as well. But as you think about the beauty that goes into this temple, how beautiful it was, that helps you appreciate something in the history of Israel. Remember, after the return, there are 6 books of the New Testament that are taking place post-captivity, on the return. Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. Ezra records the first 2 returns. The return under Zerubbabel in 1-6 or 7, I believe it is, and then the last half is the return under Ezra. Then Nehemiah records his return. That's shortly after the return of Ezra, as we see Ezra in the book of Nehemiah. Esther is actually taking place back in the lands of the Medes and the Persians, but that is still after the returns. But when you come into Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, and they're dealing with the problems of the people, and they're not building the temple. And when they finally lay the foundation of the temple and get started, do you remember what the reaction of the people were? right? The ones that had never seen the temple that Solomon had built rejoiced at the building of the temple. Those that had seen it wept because you knew that this was never going to be anything like the Temple of Solomon. By the way, when you see a picture today, most likely when you see a picture of a temple today, when they talk about the temple, do you know which temple you're likely seeing? Do what? You normally see the third. There's 3 temples that are built. So you have the Temple of Solomon that we're seeing built here. You have the temple built that started with Haggai and in the book of Zechariah that's finished after the return. That temple is destroyed during the reign of Greece and Alexander the Great. Then you have what is known as the Temple of Herod. That's the temple that Herod had built. In the days of Jesus, the Temple of Herod is still under construction. That's the temple that's destroyed in AD 70 in the fall of Jerusalem. So when you see a temple today, you're likely seeing a picture of that third temple that's depicted, the one of Herod, the Temple of Herod. But you can find pictures. I have a Bible at home that's got notes in it with a sort of a layout, not like with a layout of what the Temple of Solomon would have looked like.
I'll also say that Titus's ark, which still stands in Rome today, has a depiction of the Romans coming in and cleaning out the temple and some of the artifacts that they took out of there. So if you want to see some real representation of what that may have looked like, that's a good place to go historically as well.
Thank you. Good point. So yeah, you're normally seeing the third. So when you're seeing, in terms of if you're comparing from beauty, Solomon's is by far the most beautiful of the temples that was built. Herod's would have been second, and then the third one would have been the one built during the return that was destroyed during the days of the Grecian Empire. But that's why the people cry there as the temple is being built. You think of just all the beauty of this, and you think of all the preparation that goes in, the preparation that David has put behind it, the gifts of the people that we didn't even get to go into detail of last week, for time's sake, as they bring all the gifts for the building of the temple. You think about the preparation Solomon goes in and all this, because Solomon made the point, we're building a temple that is what? It is great, and God is what? Greater than all gods. He's greater than all the idols that you can serve. That's why Solomon then went so elaborate with the building of the temple. Solomon's point was, God is great, and He's the creator of the world, and He's greater than all these gods that you serve, and so we're building this temple for Him. Our time is almost up, so we'll just list a couple of practical lessons real quick. 2 Chronicles 3 is very similar, by the way. 1 and 2 is the beginning of the construction. 3 to 17 is dimensions given of the temple, like we see recorded already here in 1 Kings. The first of those that we want to point out, we talked about, is the Lord keeps His promises. He kept the promise to David that his son would be the one to build the temple. We see that taking place. It started in the 4th year of Solomon. It is completed in the 11th year of Solomon. It took 7 years to build, but David's son built the temple for the Lord. It built the house for the Lord. The Lord kept His promise. He kept His promise concerning Solomon having peace from his enemies. He said, you'll have peace, and Solomon did. He kept His promise concerning Solomon having wisdom. And Solomon had that wisdom. Those are all pointed out in chapter 5 of 1 Kings. The Lord keeps His promises. Second thing, we've already talked about this somewhat, but promises are conditional. Can be conditional. Promises are conditional. Solomon was told, as long as you keep my statutes, as long as you observe my words, as long as you do what I tell you to do, then everything will be okay. As long as you do that, I will not leave you, I will not leave Israel, I will not forsake them, I will keep my promise. But that promise is conditional. If you do not keep it, then I will not be there, and you cannot find me. I also see a need for obedience. I see that in the Lord's instructions to Solomon. When He told Solomon in 1 Kings chapter 6 that he needed to execute my ordinances, keep my commandments, and walk in them. What He just told him to do was, you need to obey me, obey me, obey me. Obey what I have commanded you. Obey what I have commanded all of Israel. You obey, they obey, then I am with you. The same thing's true for us today. As long as we follow the commands that God has given us today, as long as we obey, He will be with us. I will never leave thee nor forsake thee, the Hebrew writer wrote in quoting from the Old Testament in Hebrews chapter 13 and in verse 5 and in verse 6. But if we turn away from God, then He will not be found by us. So we need to obey Him just as they were told to obey the Lord at that point. So we see the importance and the need for obedience. Next week we'll be in chapters 7, 8, and 9 of 1 Kings and 4 through 7 of 2 Chronicles.